Greetings, bibliophiles, and welcome back to The Book Thing. And this time around, it's a first for the channel in that I'm going to be talking about some non-fiction for a change. Most of the purpose of this second channel is to cover long-form fiction, as I like to call it. So that's why I've been doing TV series and books, but not films, because films are their own thing. But yeah, mostly it's been fiction, and I mostly read fiction, but occasionally I like to read something a bit different, and in this case it's Vulcan 607 by Rowland White, which is an account of the April 1982, or was it May? I can't remember. Anyway, around that kind of time, the Vulcan bombing raid on the airport at Port Stanley during the Falklands conflict, and I wasn't expecting to like this that much, but actually no, it was quite good. It was quite enjoyable. Now, this is a fairly straightforward narrative account. There's no kind of analysis or anything of that sort going on. I mean, this is not setting out to analyze the rights and wrongs of the Falklands conflict, and it's not trying to do a comprehensive anything of the conflict as a whole. It is very specifically about the first of the Operation Black Buck raids, as they were called, and it does that fairly well. I mean, it does throw in a couple of other, like, it builds up some context first, and it kind of leads in for the first maybe 60% of the book with the invasion of the Falklands, and then Britain's response, and then that leads into the RAF decision to try and mount a raid to see if they, to start planning for a raid to see if it was possible with what they had, and with the eventual decision to go ahead, and then all the difficulties that entailed right up to the last minute and beyond. And it really does sort of go into the extraordinary effort of the individuals involved, and that really is the focus of the book. Is it's all the people that were involved with this. It's not a dry history. It's a very kind of focused on the players, if I can call them that, kind of history. Now, the prose itself is actually fairly clunky. Rowland White, I don't know if he's written anything since then. I probably should have looked that up. But, I mean, this was his first published anything. And how it came about was that he was really interested in this specific bit of history, because the Vulcan raids on the Falklands were, at the time, the longest range bomber raids in history. And that was only surpassed 10 years later by, during the Gulf War, by B-52 Stratofortresses flying all the way from the continental US to Iraq. And those, the US Air Force had the advantage of being able to launch tankers to refuel those in their path. Whereas over the South Atlantic, flying from Ascension Island all the way down to the Falklands, which is several thousand miles, they really didn't have that luxury. And so what they had to do was use their existing tanker force, which was the Handley Page Victor, which was one of the original V bombers, and they had to form this kind of pyramid where they were refueling each other to get a single Vulcan bomber, which contained the actual bomb load, over the target in the Falkland Islands. And just the amount of sheer planning and effort that had to go into making that happen, it's actually really quite engrossing. So even, it's like, just leaving aside the rights and wrongs and the politics and all the analysis, and it doesn't really do any of that. It's not setting out to do that. It's just telling this one story. It is actually quite fascinating, just the amount of difficulties they had to overcome, because the Vulcans themselves, I mean, the Victors were quite aged at that point. I think the Victors were the last of the V-bombers to come into service, but the Vulcans, they were literally 6 months from retirement, something like that, and then suddenly they were being pressed into service to perform this duty that basically no one had ever conceived of, because this was still very much, the Cold War era. All of the RAF's planning was around, well, how are we going to cope if the Soviets decide to invade Western Europe? And suddenly they've got this tiny little speck of rock down in the South Atlantic to try and get some bombers down to. So it completely threw them for a loop. And you add the aging bombers on top of that, which had been for years and years, like their purpose had been as nuclear delivery bombers, and suddenly they're being pressed back into service as conventional bombers. And on top of all that, although theoretically they had the capability to do aerial refueling, they hadn't they'd done some tests in the 60s, and then they'd never really. This hadn't really been built into their operational profile since then. So all of that equipment inside the Victor, the Vulcans rather, the fuel lines and the probes had all been kind of removed and stopped up. So they just had all of these technical and planning and logistical hurdles to overcome, and it's actually it was surprisingly interesting, and the writing itself, it's quite clunky in places. I will say that. This is the worst thing I can say about this book, is that there are paragraphs sometimes that you will read and you'll just wince at how they're worded, but the actual pacing, the way in which the author laid out the information and the amount of information he chose to give, because doubtless he accrued a lot more than he could have put in the book. The way it's presented, the pace at which it's presented, it was surprisingly good. It was surprisingly engrossing, and I'm actually, I'm going to recommend this one as one to go for if you've any interest in just like recent military history, or just I don't know. It was just interesting. So I'm going to read a very short excerpt, which is like page and a bit, 2 pages, 2.5 pages, something like that. I mean, you can look up the bare bones of what happened on Wikipedia, for instance, but that doesn't give you anything of the depth that's in this book. And there's a little bit of speculation in here, and I think it's fair to say that Rowland White maybe attaches a little bit more importance to the Black Buck bombing raids than they actually had. But the fact that they happened at all, and the fact that the RAF was able to carry them out, was remarkable, and it really does capture that. In the vault at Waddington, the 2 nav radars, Mick Cooper and Bob Wright, bent over desks studying maps of East Falkland. They made an odd pair. Cooper, the untidy red-haired veteran, Wright, the neat, earnest first tourist. They were in the vault to be briefed by Simon Baldwin's ops team and to do their target study. Used to beautifully prepared, comprehensive target information, including photographs from Jarrick, the Joint Air Reconnaissance Intelligence Centre at RAF Brampton in Huntingdonshire, they were now provided with little more than a few old maps. As far as they could, Simon Baldwin's ops team had tried to replicate the nuclear training system the crews were familiar with, preparing go bags for each crew member that contained all the information they needed to fly the mission. The flight plan had been hastily revised to an attack track that cut the runway, and pop-up was at 30 miles from the target. I should maybe explain here that the original planning was that they would run down the length of the runway and drop bombs to try and crater it, so the Argentine Air Force would have a hard time using it. But they then basically went back to World War II tactics and actually cut it across at an angle, and then they had to also do a pop-up maneuver. So instead of a low-level run down the runway, which is what the Vulcan, the entire Vulcan attack profile, the entire V-Bomber Force attack profile was based on low-level raids. But doing it at a really low level, A, was very risky with the air defences, and B, meant that the bombs would just kind of explode on the surface of the runway, and what they wanted was the bombs to burrow into the surface of the runway and then explode and cause much more damage. So they would pop up from low level, coming in under the radar, going to high level and drop these bombs, and so the bombs would have further to fall and burrow in and then cause more damage. So anyway, enough explanation. The flight plan had been hastily revised to attack attack track that cut the runway, and pop-up was at 30 miles from the target. While the nav plotter's charts were less than ideal, it was still the nav radar's planning that was made most difficult by the lack of detailed information. The Vulcan's offset bombing facility allowed the nav radar to release the bombs accurately without ever having to put the radar crosshairs on the target itself. This was particularly useful at low level, where targets such as runways would not paint on the radar because they had no vertical extent. At the pre-flight planning stage, the nav radar would identify a feature on the map which he was confident would show on his radar. Then, by inputting the distance and location of these to the relative target onto the NBS computer, he could aim at the offset and leave the machine to do the rest. To do the offset planning, Waddington had been crying out for large-scale maps and photographs of the target area, but none was available. The Falklands had never featured on Jarrick's list of concerns. The ops team had to make do with copies of an elderly 1 to 250,000 scale map, and these were not of a sufficiently large scale to show potentially good offsets like air traffic control towers. 2 jetties were marked out on the maps around Cape Pembroke, but were they wood, steel, or concrete? That would affect their radar return. Given the age of the maps, were they even still there? The ops team were forced to go back to basics and use geographical features like Mingiri Point, Cape Pembroke, Ordnance Point, and Eagle Headland, where land and sea meet. And even these apparently reliable features were less than ideal as bomb release offsets because they moved with the changing tides. With luck, given the medium altitude of the bomb run, the nav radars would be able to paint the runway itself and place their crosshairs over the target. That, though, was no more than a possibility, and certainly not something upon which they could hang the success of the mission. The nav radar would also have to set the stick spacing for the bombs. Since the targeting conference in the station commander's office, the ops team had discovered that the optimum setting for the 90-way bomb control unit was 0.24 seconds between bombs. This translated at ground level into 54 yards between each bomb, but although the runway was only 40 yards wide, there was no danger of missing completely because the Vulcan wouldn't be flying at 90 degrees to it. Rather than having a target 40 yards across, the 35-degree angle of the cut meant that the potential target increased to 76 yards. If 2 bombs straddled the runway perfectly, each would land well within the opposite edges of the paved surface. The craters, plus heave, would rip out each side of the runway. Baldwin's planners were fortunate. They had a 90-way setting that meant they didn't have to hit the centre line to put the strip out of action. In the normal scheme of things, crews weren't allowed to even discuss their targets with other crews. The restricted access to the vault was absolute. As the corporate crews refined their attack plans, and corporate was the name of the operation at the airbase, the target planning room continued to be where the rest of the Vulcan force planned the nuclear mission that was, for the next few months at least, still declared to NATO. The AARIs, the aerial refueling instructors basically, although now joining the Vulcan crews on the attack itself, weren't clear to enter. It didn't seem right, and Pete Standing, attached to John Reeves' crew, was quietly taken aside and filled in on the details of the discussions taking place on the other side of the door. Throughout the day, other preparations were made for the deployment to Ascension. Careful not to miss a trick, John Reeve and his crew looked into whether they were entitled some sort of tropical allowance. The Falklands might be on the edge of the Antarctic Circle, but Ascension looked promising. Reeve himself qualified for a pittance to re-rank his KD's khaki drill tropical kit, but Mick Cooper struck gold. Having left the Air Force before rejoining, he was entitled to hundreds of pounds to renew the whole lot. That sort of cash, he baited his crewmates, was going to pay for a fantastic new TV and radio. Reeve ran around the station seeing what he could catch out of different departments to make the deployment more comfortable. The sports centre were happy to send them down to Ascension with whatever they could spare. He had less success, however, with the library. You'll have to sign out the books individually, and each of you can only have 2. Reeve was incredulous. Let's get this right. The station's going to war, and you're telling me you can't help? He didn't have the time or energy to argue, and turned on his heel, muttering darkly about the librarian being a stickler for rules. So I think that kind of illustrates, hopefully, what I'm talking about. There's no deep analysis of the Falklands War as a whole, but instead what we get is a nice mix of these kind of personal details, stuff about the librarian and the tropical kit, but also the planning and operational difficulties involved, and he brings it together quite nicely. So even though it's not the smoothest prose I've ever read by any means, overall, it didn't take me that long to read this, only a couple of weeks, and the last part of it, honestly, like the first like 60%, where it's all about the lead up to the operation, I was kind of reading a bit every night, basically. It's fairly easy stuff to read, and then once it got to the actual operation itself and the aftermath of the operation, which is the last like third of the book, maybe last 40%, something like that, I basically read all that straight through in the space of about 4.5 hours last night, in fact. So I wasn't expecting to, I wasn't planning to, but I got to that point, and then I just kept reading because I couldn't put it down, because I wanted to find out what happened. And I knew the bare details. I knew they carried it off. I knew that the first of the Black Buck raids was successful in cratering the runway at Port Stanley, but there was still quite a lot of drama involved, and there were some fairly tense moments for the final air crews of both the Vulcan and the Victor that was on the last leg. And it actually ends up with a little coda of one of the follow-up raids. I think it was Black Buck, either 5 or 6, where they actually had to divert to the airport at Rio de Janeiro, because they couldn't make their well, actually no, they made the tanker rendezvous, that was it, but the refueling probe sheared off, so they weren't going to make it back to Ascension. So they landed at the airport in Rio with very little fuel left, and it very nearly went badly wrong. So these raids were absolutely pushing the limit of what the RAF could do and what the Vulcans and the Victors could do, but they did it, and that's the remarkable thing, and the fact that they made it happen, coming through all of the obstacles which he sets out rather nicely. It was quite gripping stuff in the end. So I can recommend that one. I really can. So that's largely it for this episode, although I will mention one last little thing, in that I'm going to experiment with making these available as just MP3s that you can download as well. I'm going to try out SoundCloud to start with, although SoundCloud does limit you if you don't pay for the service, and I don't know if it'll come to that, but I might just keep using their free service and delete the old ones every so often. But yeah, there'll be a link in the description below to SoundCloud, and you can download this for your MP3 player or whatever, and give it a go that way. And that'll be true for future ones as well. So hopefully you have enjoyed this first non-fiction review on the channel, and if you have, you can leave any comments below. You can hit that like button. You can sub to this channel, or my main channel, if you haven't already. And as always, stay tuned for more.